Chapter 4, Risk Analysis and Environmental Health Hazards. Start off talking a little bit about pesticides and the effect that they can have on people that are exposed to them. Chemicals in general, and pesticides in particular, are far more harmful to children than adults, partially because they tend to expose themselves to the pesticides more by playing outside, putting their hands in their mouth, or touching things and then putting their hands in their mouth. So they put themselves at risk simply by being more likely to be exposed to those chemicals. But also, and of equal importance, is that their bodies are still developing and growing, so they can tend to have a greater response because they're more sensitive to those chemicals. This would also be true of elderly people and people who have compromised immune systems through some sort of disease like AIDS. Pesticides and other chemicals can have a wide variety of effects on the people that are exposed to them. Everything from various types of cancer to developmental problems that can affect their mental or physical abilities in the future. So primarily things like intelligence and motor skills, as demonstrated by the figure on the right. A stick drawing of a person made by a child that wasn't exposed to any of these sorts of chemicals, compared to the image on the right where a child was asked to draw a person and basically couldn't put those skills from their brain to their hands to actually draw a person. A lot of our exposure to dangers and environmental health hazards is based on the perception that we have of the risk associated with those items. Risk is defined as the probability of harm and how that occurs under different circumstances. Certainly risk is inherent in our daily lives. We're exposed to all sorts of things every day that pose a risk to our health. So risk management is actually the process of identifying, assessing, and reducing those risks. But we also have to take into account that sometimes our perception of a risk is very different than the actual probability of that type of risk. So looking at the image on the right, every year people die from improperly discharging fireworks, to dying in floods and earthquakes, to being killed by lightning or the sting of a wasp or hornet. You start noticing that we get up to an air accident, which is 1 in 7,000. There probably are a lot more people that are afraid to fly because they perceive that it's more dangerous. But if you compare the probability of dying in an air accident at 1 in 7,000, and then you look farther to the left of this figure, you actually have a 1 in 88 chance of dying in a motor vehicle accident. So you have about 100 times greater probability of dying in a car accident than a plane accident. But again, we perceive being in a plane as being much more dangerous. And then things like dying from stroke or cancer. Even though we have a pretty high probability of dying from cancer or from heart disease, that doesn't necessarily affect our behavior when it comes to avoiding the things that could cause this risk, like smoking or the type of diets that a lot of Americans have, high in fat. So again, those are pretty high probabilities, but yet we could easily change the activities that affect those risks, but we don't. Again, we have different in perception between reality a lot of times. So basically there are steps involved in assessing risks with respect to behaviors, or in the case of this chapter specifically, being exposed to chemicals. So there are both quantitative, which is measurable, scientific, and qualitative, which is more based on observation, ways that we can characterize risk. First, by identifying the hazard and determining whether exposure can adversely affect our health. Then looking at a dose-response assessment, which is the relationship between the amount of a chemical we're exposed to and then the response to that level of chemical. Third, exposure assessment, which is based on how often individuals might be exposed to a particular chemical. And then finally, risk characterization, which leads back to determining the actual risk management. So the image on the right talks about how DDT levels in blood compare between the general population and Mexican Americans. And as you can tell, the DDT levels are much higher in Mexican Americans compared to individuals who are just part of the general population. We'll talk more about DDT, but it's one of those chemicals that we used extensively in the United States to control mosquitoes. We thought the benefit of controlling mosquitoes outweighed any of the risks involved. But eventually we, thanks to people like Rachel Carson, figured out that DDT was a high-risk chemical that could do a lot of damage to the environment. So although we don't use it any longer in the United States, it's very persistent and it still shows up in our environment occasionally. But more importantly, we may not use it in this country, but it's still manufactured and sold to other countries or made by other countries and used there, like, for example, in Mexico. So anybody working in and around these chemicals or living near where these chemicals are used, as demonstrated by this image, are far more likely to have that chemical in their bodies. As I mentioned on the previous slide, it seems that people are oftentimes more concerned about things that pose a very small risk compared to a large risk. Large risks, like we mentioned earlier, things like heart disease, other health problems that can be affected by obesity and smoking. Even though those are fairly large risks, people still continue the behaviors that put themselves at risk for dying from those types of issues. Whereas again, the small risks like chemicals in our water, people oftentimes worry more about those things. The average life expectancy is reduced by 8 years for smokers, and a third of smokers die from related illnesses. So there's clearly a tie to the use of tobacco and things like lung cancer, throat cancer, heart disease, and so forth. The image on the right indicates an area that's affected by cancer from a person who was a smoker. So why the difference in concerns? Well, a lot of it's habit. Again, we develop habits like smoking or having a poor diet, or they can be affected by a culture of a group of people versus actually analyzing the risks. Again, it's all about perception of risks. Flying in an airplane versus driving in a car. As I mentioned, you have a much higher risk of dying from a car accident than an airplane accident. But our perception always is, if I'm driving along in my car, and this has nothing to do with an accident, but I'm driving along in my car and something goes wrong with my engine, I just kind of can coast off the side of the road. Whereas if I'm in a plane and something goes wrong, the plane just doesn't coast to a rest. It usually crashes. And so if that happens, it can affect a lot of people. But the actual risk is still much, much greater in an automobile than an airplane. But it's all about that perception. Then also just trusting in the institutions. For long time periods, we've been exposed to commercials and the companies that make products telling us how safe they are. We get to develop a trust, even if what they're saying isn't true. Or At this point, we don't know something's wrong. We don't find out till later. So again, we tend to trust things maybe to a fault and believe that they're safe because we're told that they're safe. And then also just feeling that some risks can't be controlled. My grandpa, who's long since been gone, had always mentioned that basically at the time, he was old enough that he was working actually when he was 6, 7, 8 years old. And also because he was around other people at that time who were much older and who smoked, when smoking was pretty much the common thing to do, he started smoking when he was, very, very young. I mean, literally 8, 9 years old. Smoked all of his life. He died fairly young. He was 76 years old, but it wasn't from any kind of cancer related to smoking. So people kind of developed this idea that, if I'm meant to die from smoking or I'm meant to die from drinking, that'll just happen. But the feeling that it's completely a random event, not that it is really related to those behaviors of smoking or drinking. So again, there are a lot of people that feel like, I could fly 100 times in my lifetime, and if I'm meant to crash, I'm meant to crash. I'm just going to keep doing it. Or I like drinking. The chance of me dying from drinking is small, so I'm just going to keep doing it. If it happens, it happens. So again, with respect to lung cancer and smoking, that data and that research has been going on for quite a long time. Although the current data suggests that smoking is definitely on the decline among younger people, it's really not declining much in some minority groups or in some groups that are poorer by nature. The graph in figure 4.3b shows the percentage of U.S. students, basically high school students, who smoked cigarettes on at least 1 or 2 times within the past 30 days. And again, you can see the percentage has dropped by about 10%, which is pretty consistent also among males and females. You notice it kind of peaked in the mid 90s to late 90s, and then's been on a slow, steady decline, probably from more education about smoking and really outlining the risks and getting people to understand that the data that is used to collect this information is collected using the scientific process. So statistically, it's meaningful to people, hopefully, and it's causing an ongoing decline. So back to environmental health hazards. A couple definitions. We're going to use the word toxicant, which are any chemicals that have negative impacts on our health. And basically all chemicals are toxic. It's just a matter of how much exposure results in injury or death or some sort of negative process. We'll talk later that dust is considered an air pollutant. When you see agriculture fields being plowed in the summertime, kicking up all the dust, when that gets up into the atmosphere and gets moved around, and if we inhale it, it's an air pollutant because it clogs up our lungs. So again, any chemical will be toxic. It's just a matter of how much exposure is needed to cause a negative impact. So then toxicology is actually the study of the effects of these toxicants on living things, whether it's a plant, an animal, a human, a microscopic organism. And basically toxicologists evaluate the mechanisms that cause chemicals to be toxic. And also, very importantly, these are the people who develop ways to prevent or at least to minimize the adverse effects of these chemicals. One example, and you can even see this around any college campus now, is there are data sheets posted in every building that has chemicals in it. Now, the chemistry building, that's an obvious one because there are lots of chemicals in there. But even buildings where gasoline is used, and other chemicals that you may not even think are necessarily toxic have these sheets and warnings and guidelines posted so that people that are in the building or using those chemicals are clear on how to safely handle those chemicals in order to avoid or again minimize exposure to those chemicals. Epidemiology is a specific branch of science that studies how toxicants or biological agents, diseases, whether they're natural or not, and physical agents like accidents or radiation leaks affect the health of human populations. So in order to determine the effects of these toxicants, basically there are large study groups of people that are gathered, data is collected on to investigate all the different causes and types of diseases and injuries that can result from exposure to toxicants. A couple more definitions, I guess, is that exposure to toxicants can either be what we call acute or chronic. Acute meaning kind of immediate impacts from exposure, and chronic could be exposure to something over a long time, even if it's a small dose, but over a long time, chronic exposure can also lead to health problems. So again, acute toxicity refers to immediate effects, even after just a single exposure in a short period of time, but generally to a high level of a chemical that can be pretty potent or toxic. Typical symptoms might include dizziness, nausea, or even fairly rapid death if it's a bad enough toxin that people are exposed to. And again, compare that to chronic toxicity, which results from long-term exposure to even very low-level contaminants. We know more about acute toxicity, the chemicals that are really nasty or the things that are really nasty that can cause immediate problems. But just by the nature of chronic toxicity, we know very much less about it. Again, when it takes 10, 20, 30 years of exposure to something for the negative side effects to accumulate bad enough to show up, we just don't have that much time, or we haven't had that much time to study some of these chemicals. If they've only been out and have only been used for the past 5, 6, 10 years, we can't possibly know what the effects are going to be over the next 20 or 30 years yet. But that's also why we spend a lot of effort studying these chemicals, ongoing studies that look at the short and long-term effects. We also have disease-causing agents that aren't created by humans. They're natural pathogens that cause disease, viruses, bacteria, protozoa, parasitic worms that can cause diseases. Things like typhoid, cholera, dysentery, polio are all transmissible through contamination of food and water. But again, these are disease-causing agents that live in the environment naturally. We've been able to control them with chemicals, with immunizations in children. But again, these are natural things that live in the environment, not things that humans have created. Certainly, back in Chapter 1, we talked about some of the worldwide problems, especially in those less developed countries, just the inability of those people to be able to get adequate nutrition and clean water. So definitely, contaminated water is a major threat to public health worldwide. Certainly in developed countries like the United States, we've had the technology and use it to create safe public drinking water supplies. Doesn't mean we don't continually test those supplies, and it doesn't mean, unfortunately, that we still don't occasionally have outbreaks of things like E. coli. We had an outbreak of cryptosporidium back in '93, a waterborne E. coli outbreak in Canada in 2000, and then outbreaks of things like cholera worldwide in Zimbabwe and Haiti in recent times. So it's not that these things don't affect the more developed countries, even with our fairly safe water supplies. But the bigger problems are still in those less developed countries, where they basically are just drinking water right out of the lakes and rivers. The same lakes and rivers that they bathe in, that their cattle use, and that toxins are dumped into from production or from agriculture. So table 4.1 just kind of lists some of the most common diseases that are affecting humans that are transmitted by polluted water, and the type of organism that spreads that disease, and some of the symptoms associated with that disease. Cholera, the biggest one probably worldwide. It doesn't tend to kill people outright, but if over time you continue to have severe diarrhea and vomiting, you're losing fluid. And if you lose fluids, you become dehydrated. And if you become dehydrated, you continue to have cramps, and eventually it can lead to death if it isn't treated. So a lot of these diseases, again, don't kill people outright, but it makes them weaker and weaker to the point where then they can become more susceptible as well to other problems that ultimately could kill them. So it's definitely good to know some of these diseases and what causes them and what some of the symptoms are. As we move through time, and as the human population continues to grow and get more dense, we tend to have been noticing more and more of these emerging diseases. 25% of injury and disease is related to human-caused environmental changes. So the more of us there are on the planet, the more likely these types of injuries or diseases are going to continue to occur at an even higher rate in the future. If we continue to affect the climate, again, hotter, drier, or cooler, wetter, we can definitely affect the ability of these disease agents to thrive in these new communities. Generally, things, microorganisms, diseases, do better in a moister climate that's not too hot or not too cold. So as we continue to affect the climate, there will be places on the planet that are warmer than they used to be, places that are moister or wetter than they used to be, and basically that means that these types of diseases will become more prevalent in those areas anyway. As we continue to cut forests worldwide, as we continue to build dams, not so much in places like the United States, where we've pretty much dammed all of the major rivers that we can, but in other countries where they continue to do dams and different types of agricultural practices. This can definitely put humans in greater contact with these disease-causing agents. And then as the human population continues to grow, these disease agents can continue to spread more rapidly. Probably all know that the higher density of people in an area, the easier it is to spread a disease. If you're in a classroom with a bunch of other students and somebody got a cold or someone got the flu, if people are all packed in together, it's much easier for airborne diseases to spread just because people are close to each other. So even in the bigger picture, where a human population is growing and getting denser and denser, more people in less space, it's going to be much easier for these diseases to spread. So there are a variety of social factors, aside from what I was just talking about, that contribute to these epidemics of diseases. Things like drainage ditches on either sides of the road in an area where forests are being cleared creates better breeding ground for mosquito larvae. Again, they need standing water, not moving water, so any place that the water can pool up is going to provide better habitat for mosquito to breed. Also, just with the advent of airplanes And the fact that now you can hop on a plane and be halfway around the world within a day allows for much greater spread of diseases. Remember, when we, as humans, lived around the planet, before there were ships or airplanes, we adapted and evolved to the diseases that were in the area we lived in. People died from those diseases, but the ones that had the right genetic combination survived, and they had babies, and the babies were resistant mostly to those diseases. But then all of a sudden now, you may be resistant to a disease in the Amazon rainforest, or in somewhere in Africa, or even in Florida in the United States. Now you start traveling around the world. You're not only potentially bringing diseases with you to other places in the world where people haven't been exposed to those diseases, but then you're also working or living or just vacationing in an area where there are diseases that you haven't been exposed to. It's kind of the sort of germ warfare that we've used as Europeans coming to this country and Spaniards coming to this country to affect the Native American populations, or say the Spanish as they went into South America, taking diseases with them like smallpox that the native populations didn't have any resistance to because it was never a disease that evolved in the areas they lived. So global travel has definitely contributed to the spread of diseases over great distances. And then also, as we mentioned, with more and more people living in cities, where by nature human populations are concentrated, it allows again for a much more rapid spread of diseases when you have high densities of people living in a relatively small area. Diseases can also be carried by animals, though. Malaria and West Nile virus spread by mosquitoes, Lyme's disease by deer ticks, and bubonic plague, which even still exists in the United States, can be spread by rats and fleas. Fleas that also live on chipmunks and other squirrel species. If you've been to a park around California, you'll oftentimes see signs that say something like "don't feed the chipmunks" or "don't feed the squirrels." The rat fleas that live on those animals do carry the plague. Now again, very, very, very few people ever get that in the United States, but it is still out there in the environment, just not as common as Lyme's disease or West Nile virus. Now also keep in mind, because again we tend to, our perception versus the reality of these diseases, most of us have probably already been bitten by a mosquito that carries West Nile virus. And we may have already been bitten by a tick that carries Lyme's disease. But yet we aren't all dead from it, or we didn't maybe get sick from it. Most people are going to have a resistance to these diseases. You might have gotten bit by a West Nile virus mosquito and maybe even just felt like you had a cold for a couple days and then it passed. But yes, people still do die from it. And we should be aware of it. We should protect ourselves from ticks, because you don't want to be that one person out of 1,000 that gets West Nile or Lyme's disease and dies from it. People do die from these diseases. But again, the reality is most of us have probably already been exposed to these diseases, and they aren't bad enough to affect us to the point where we're going to get deathly ill from it. So another definition, a pandemic. This is a specific type of disease that can reach nearly every part of the world at the same time and has the ability, it's strong enough or virile enough to be able to affect almost everyone. Now again, that doesn't mean that everyone dies from it. There are people every year that just die from taking aspirin or some other sort of drug, over the counter or prescription. They're very susceptible for whatever reason to the chemicals in that drug. But again, most of us don't. So it's just about that perception versus reality. So pandemic diseases like the major influenzas like bird flu, avian flu, in the past have killed lots of people. But again, these things are not just easily transmitted to humans. Some diseases, it's really difficult. But once affected, the mortality rate for humans can be very high. One of the reasons why scientists develop flu vaccines every year, and why more and more people hopefully are getting that vaccine. The H1N1 swine flu that came around the world in 2009 had a huge impact in Mexico and became a pandemic in just a few months, so spread worldwide, again killing a bunch of people. Just one little side note that people have this very high misunderstanding about. The idea that the flu shot can give people the flu is absolutely wrong. Usually if people get a shot and then get the flu, it means they waited too long to get the shot. They already had the flu virus in them. It just hadn't started giving them symptoms yet. It's a dead vaccine. It's not a living thing. And so again, you can't get the flu from getting the flu shot. But it's just a matter of getting it early enough in the season so that you have it in your body and it's working before you're exposed to the virus. So there are certainly large groups of scientists around the world that work to understand these pandemic diseases and, again, how to control the pandemics. And they do this by first understanding the environment and what conditions it takes to allow that virus to survive, and not only survive, but move or travel from place to place. Again, because we're talking at worldwide spread here, it does no good if just the people in the United States think about this. It has to be a worldwide cooperation among governments and individuals worldwide to address these pandemics when they come out, and then work together to come up with a plan on how to control the pandemic. People who live and work very close to livestock can be more susceptible to some of these problems that we've already talked about, like avian flu. Once it gets to humans, it can be spread rapidly, but it's less likely or it's harder for it to spread. But once it does, then again, it can be a problem. Same with swine flu. Children, especially in places like rural China, that actually play with livestock, sort of as pets, pigs and chickens, are similar enough genetically that these types of diseases can be transferred among them and then, again, to the children. As I mentioned a couple slides ago, one of the important issues related to toxicology is to be able to understand and study how they move through the environment and what eventually happens to them as they move through the environment. Again, these are two basic things we have to know if we're going to be able to control the spread of chemicals that get into the environment. So there are some of these toxicants that are particularly dangerous because they not only resist degrading in the environment, typically that means they're not water soluble. The environment is full of water. A chemical that breaks down in the water is going to tend to become less and less toxic very quickly. So chemicals that don't break down in the water can be resistant to that degradation, which means they can persist for quite a while. And then the second thing is that some of these chemicals have the ability to move quickly through the environment. So they can spread rapidly from one place to another, giving them the opportunity to affect more people or more animals. So I mentioned DDT a few slides ago, and so it's kind of the one that has probably, more than any other toxicant, has had a huge impact on the environment here in the United States and anywhere else that it's been used. Again, thanks to people like Rachel Carson, we learned that DDT was a pretty bad chemical because it, as above, resisted degradation and was able to move quickly through the environment, and was finally banned in the United States in 1972. By this time, the eagle population had been declining pretty rapidly, and we finally figured out why. It was because of DDT. Other top-level predators, like peregrine falcons, osprey, just to name a few, were declining rapidly in numbers as well, and we eventually tied it to DDT. Now again, DDT isn't a chemical that just outright kills things. What it does in birds is it interferes with the metabolism of calcium. What are eggshells made of? Largely calcium. So when these birds would lay eggs, the eggshells were thin and just weren't as structurally sound, and so just trying to incubate the eggs would cause them to crack. And so, given time, if you have an adult population and they're not making babies for a period of years or even decades, the population is going to slowly decline. So if there's no reproduction, eventually the species could go extinct. Again, DDT is a very persistent chemical. It's fat soluble, so it can accumulate in the tissue of animals, in the fatty tissue of animals. That's why it doesn't degrade in water, so it stays in the environment until it's ingested by something living. And then also, DDT has the ability to bioaccumulate. Again, because it resists degradation, it can move quickly through a food chain. So if it's in the water, you've got all the little microorganisms living in the water who ingest this chemical, and then the next step up the food chain eats a lot of those little microscopic things, so the level of DDT gets a little more concentrated. Then you have another level consumer that's eating a lot of those other primary consumers, so DDT gets a little more concentrated. Then you have a secondary consumer, and then you finally have a tertiary consumer, like a bald eagle, that eats a lot of the levels below it. So as this image shows, you can go from a very, very small concentration of DDT in the water to a relatively high concentration of DDT in the fatty tissue of a top-level carnivore, where basically this graph shows that DDT can be concentrated by about 1.5 million times over what it is just in the water. So then, because DDT is persistent, it doesn't break down readily, it can take years, because it accumulates in the fatty tissue, and then because it can magnify up the food chain from very low to relatively high concentrations, it can have the ability to then be toxic enough or be at a high enough concentration to start having some sort of toxic effect. And again, although DDT doesn't kill things outright, if they don't reproduce, eventually that means they're going to go extinct. So again, a few terms here to make sure that you commit to memory. Persistence, that something can be stable and take years to break down. That it can bioaccumulate, in other words, concentrate in the case of DDT in fatty tissue, and that it can biomagnify up a food chain from very low concentrations to relatively high concentrations. So again, one of those things we have to understand in order to control the effects of these chemicals is how mobile they are. Toxicants can move through the soil, they can move through water, and some of them can disperse through the air. So knowing how the chemical or toxicant can disperse is obviously a very first step to understanding how to control it. Agricultural pesticides, for example, which DDT was, can run off into rivers and streams. Not only do they have the capacity to affect the living things in that water, but then where does that water flow? Downstream, into lakes, into oceans, where it can have an adverse effect on all the aquatic plants and animals. Again, things like DDT that affect calcium can actually affect bone development in fish and basically make their bones really weak, which means they are probably going to be more susceptible to being eaten by a predator. Back in 1994, after the Clean Water Act and revisions of the Clean Water Act, there were a number of toxicants that were identified to be prevalent in drinking water in the United States. There were environmental working groups that were looking at this, and basically they found that in places like the Midwest, so states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, those areas, there were about 3.5 million people that had elevated risks of cancer due to exposure from pesticides in their drinking water. The EPA has then mandated a reduction in the use of those particular herbicides that were labeled the dirty dozen, the 12 most toxic chemicals that fit all those criteria for making them bad. Again, that they resist breaking down, they move through the environment quickly, they can accumulate up a food chain. So chemicals like aldrin, chloridane, of course DDT, dieldrin, endrin, heptachlor, and you can look through the rest of those persistent organic pollutants. Pretty much all of them used as insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, or things like dioxins and PCBs that are byproducts of making things. I grew up in Wisconsin, and that's bordering on Lake Michigan. Back in the 70s, there were all sorts of warnings about PCB levels in Lake Michigan. And again, it wasn't about drinking the water, it was about eating the fish that you caught in the water. There was actually limitations on the size of fish you could keep. The bigger the salmon, the more likely that it would have higher concentrations of these chemicals in it. So you were recommended to eat only smaller fish and only eat a certain amount every month, so that hopefully those chemicals couldn't accumulate in humans. Lake Michigan is surrounded by a bunch of large industrialized cities, so those industrial processes were dumping PCBs into the lake prior to us really understanding that that was a bad thing. So going back to the Stockholm Convention on these persistent organic pollutants, in 2001, basically there was a global ban on these persistent organic pollutants because of all of the negative side effects. So there was a United Nations treaty that basically was designed to protect human health from these dirty dozen pollutants. And it required countries to develop plans to basically eliminate the production and use of these chemicals. So again, looking towards shifting to different chemicals away from these really bad ones. There is an exception. DDT was invented basically initially to control mosquitoes that spread malaria. So we were using it when we were fighting the wars in Southeast Asia, in those tropical areas. More of our service people were dying or ill from malaria because of their exposure to it. So scientists developed a chemical that could be sprayed over the battlefields so that those mosquitoes would die off so our people wouldn't get ill. And then when the war was over, we decided, well, this worked so well, we'll use it as a chemical to control mosquitoes in this country, and then eventually to control other types of pests in this country. There's I believe there's still a DVD, actually I should say a YouTube video link on Moodle about Rachel Carson and DDT, where it shows trucks driving down roads with houses on both sides spraying DDT powder. Kids are outside playing in it, and just at the time we just didn't know how bad that stuff was. So how do we actually determine the health effects of pollutants? Toxicity itself is determined by determining the dose that starts to produce some sort of negative or adverse effect. Dose is defined as the amount of a toxicant that enters the body, and the response is defined as the type and amount of damage that body receives to a particular dose of a chemical or toxicant. We look at two things. Basically, what is the lethal dose, the dose that results in death to that organism, or the sublethal dose that doesn't kill the organism but causes some sort of harm to that organism. In the past, we either tested monkeys, since we assumed they were the closest living thing on this planet to us. With animal rights and such, we certainly have moved away from using primates as our test subjects to things like pigs, which are physiologically similar to us, or certainly the obligatory lab rat or lab mouse. And so basically these organisms are administered different doses of a chemical in a controlled laboratory setting, and then they're monitored over time, and then that data is used to predict the effect on humans. Again, there's no perfect species out there that is exactly like us. So the dose that actually results in illness or death in a rat or a pig or any other animal is never going to be exactly like it would be in a human. But again, short of testing humans, which we no longer do, there's no better way to test the effects. We also do use cells, so we'll collect cells from humans or animals, and we'll expose those cells to these chemicals. So that's another way that we might test the effects of these chemicals. So what comes from this testing then is we determine the dose that is lethal to 50% of a population, and that's called the LD50. So again, we figure that on average, if a certain dose has a lethal effect on half of the population, we've determined that to be the LD50. And then if you think about it, the smaller the LD50 for a chemical, the more toxic that chemical is. If it takes a smaller dose to still kill half of the population, then clearly that is a chemical that is much more toxic than a chemical that takes a much larger dose to kill half of a population. If we look at the dose at which 50% of the population exhibits some sort of response, again, maybe symptoms of an illness, but not death, we have determined that is the ED50. And so then what we're looking for really is the threshold level, the maximum dose at which a toxicant has no measurable effect on humans or test subjects. So then doses that are lower than that threshold level are considered to be safe. Again, it would be, maybe in a perfect world, it would be great that if there's any chemical that we use that has any potential negative effect at any dose, we should ban it. But again, the reality is all of the products that we depend on to grow our food, chemicals that are required to make our computers or drive our cars, we need those chemicals. They're considered, again, a reasonable risk, because the benefit is that we get a car, we can drive our car. So in a perfect world, while it would be great that any chemical that was bad in any way was banned, it's not realistic. So the next best thing is to determine, again, that threshold level. Now, does that mean that chemical is safe for every person on the planet? Again, unfortunately, no. Some people are far more susceptible and some people are far less susceptible to any given chemical. Small doses might kill certain individuals, rare, but it happens, whereas even higher doses than the threshold level might not even make someone else sick. So it's a balancing act. It's balancing economics and politics and everything else as a way to be able to still live and get the kinds of products that we value in our society. So basically, for every chemical that's out there, every potential toxicant, we have developed a dose-response curve. which is a graph that shows the effects of different doses of a given toxicant on a population of test organisms. And notice on these graphs it shows the threshold level, the ED50 level, and then other graphs we'll look at, or other graphs that are in the book, will actually show the LD50. Again, there are chemicals that are so bad that basically they do not have a safe dose, as might be shown on the graph on the right. There's really not a threshold level for toxicant A or B on the graph on the right. So in theory, then, those chemicals would either not be used at all, or they would be very, very heavily regulated so they don't escape out into the environment where they could have a potential pretty negative impact on the population or on the living things out there in the environment. But again, it's always going to be a trade-off. We've got these dose curves. We know what is a safe or threshold level, and that is what we consider to be reasonable risk based on the benefit of whatever this chemical is. There's a particular group of substances that we probably fear the most, those that are called carcinogens, because they're a substance that can cause cancer. I was just noticing at the car dealer the other day when I took my car in for an oil change. You walk into the door in the back where the service area is, and there's a sign right on the door. This building may contain substances that are known to be carcinogenic. Well, I mean, any place where there's gasoline, that's probably going to be the case, because gasoline, or the chemicals in gasoline, can be a carcinogen if you're repeatedly exposed to the vapors or skin contact, whatever. So again, there are a lot of those labels out there for our own safety, at least to make us aware of it, but the chance of being exposed to those things probably is still pretty minimal in most cases. So how do we determine something is carcinogenic? Most common way of doing that is exposing a group of laboratory animals to various doses of this potential carcinogen and simply counting how many animals develop that cancer. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty about this because, again, not every animal is going to respond the exact same way that a human body would. And so it's pretty much just still a guess. The fact that a certain chemical might relate to causing cancer in a lab mouse doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to cause cancer in a human if they're exposed to the same amount. It could be less would cause cancer in humans, or it could be a lot more would be needed to cause cancer in humans. But again, it's the best method we've got. So risk assessment, so looking at all of the different things that we're exposed to, we can extrapolate from these lab mouse experiments in determining the expected cancer rates in humans and basically how safe some chemicals are. But usually we are just making a relatively educated guess. Again, the particular toxicant's danger may be way overestimated or it may be underestimated, but it's the best we got. We certainly, I don't want to say take advantage of this, but if we know of a group of people that have been exposed to a toxicant, we can study them to see what happens over time. Again, we don't expose people to things intentionally in order just to be able to test and see what happens. But if we know people were exposed accidentally to a chemical, then we can take advantage of that and gather as much data as possible in relation specifically then to humans. So we're looking for direct evidence of a risk in relation to being exposed to these carcinogenic chemicals, and then doing our best to put out recommendations on what is a safe level or what is a toxic level. Now, in the real world, humans are generally exposed to combinations of chemical compounds, whether they're airborne, whether we ingest them in our food or water. Yet, most studies are done on individual chemicals, not mixtures of chemicals. The challenge is that when you start mixing chemicals, you increase the level of complexity in how you actually assess the risk of those chemicals. They can have a cumulative effect, an additive effect, a synergistic effect, or even an antagonistic effect. Additive is just like one chemical plus one chemical equals two. One effect plus one effect equals two effects. The synergistic effects are the ones that are really tough to study, because there are certainly chemical interactions where 1 plus 1 equals 25, and those are really much more difficult to predict in humans. Or even again with antagonistic effects. One chemical interacts antagonistically with another chemical where they could cancel each other out to a degree, or even potentially create a whole new issue that we couldn't even predict. So in general, additive effects basically are just this effect plus that effect. No tricks there. Synergistic effects, again, can have a much greater combined effect than the individual chemicals would. And usually antagonistic effects, when you mix two chemicals together, is that they sort of cancel each other out a little bit and don't have as much of an effect. So 1 plus 1 equals, 1 1/4. As we talked about in the previous chapter, children, elderly people, and people with compromised immune systems or that are already fighting diseases are far more susceptible to exposure to chemicals. Again, they weigh less, so it takes less chemical to affect them. These LD50s, those threshold level drugs, are all based typically on weight. So because children weigh less, because they interact more with their environment, they put things in their mouth not knowing or caring what those things are. Again, because they're undergoing development, that their body is rapidly changing, which means something that gets in their body can be rapidly processed into their body. They have a higher metabolic rate. So again, they're more susceptible to being exposed to those chemicals. The Enviro Discovery near the end of the book focuses on smoking and how significant a risk it poses. Again, it's the single largest cause of preventable death. Very high risk of dying from some sort of cancer if you're a smoker. Things like lung cancer kill you or can kill you, but also chronic diseases like emphysema or heart disease can plague you your entire life if you're a smoker. Passive smoking, again, being around other people who smoke, can also increase your risk of diseases like cancer. As we saw in that graph, in the United States, the rate of smoking is declining slightly, but basically the rate of smoking, especially in very young children, is still very high in a lot of developing nations. In 2005, an international treaty was established to ban tobacco advertising. We kind of went through this with alcohol a while ago, where we could advertise beer but not the hard liquor because we were trying to, discourage people from drinking it. And the liquor manufacturers were able to kind of get that back, although there are supposedly limits on when or what time of day that they can advertise. But you do not see smoking advertisements in this country. And again, worldwide, there's that treaty that is looking to ban all advertising worldwide. So the bottom line comes down to this idea of a precautionary principle. The idea that we shouldn't adopt a new technology or a new practice, manufacturing process, a new material, until we've demonstrated that technology or whatever has a very small risk, and that the benefits of that product, whatever it is, far outweigh the risk of that product, the potential of it causing diseases or problems in the environment. And so this puts the burden of proof on the developers of that product or chemical. Again, the idea that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we can keep that chemical from getting into the environment in the first place, that's far better than having to treat a lot of sick people after we find out that that chemical was bad, but we've let it in the environment in the first place. Again, this is why a lot of drugs are very expensive, prescription drugs, because those companies that have developed those drugs have had to do very extensive testing on them. So by the time that they make it out to the public, they may have had hundreds of millions of dollars or more invested in that drug to test it. And so the same thing with pretty much all of the chemicals that are out there. Now again, that doesn't mean that anything that we can buy now is safe. Warning labels and directions in general are far more descriptive than they've ever been, and certainly that means it's up to us to read those directions and follow them if we want to minimize our risk of whatever chemical exposure we might have. But again, it's only as safe as it is applied. So again, it's up to us as the consumers to read those labels, understand what we are using, and then make an informed decision. Again, I have a YouTube posted in Moodle of some of the common household chemicals that we're exposed to. And the guy in the video kind of goes through and explains some of the negative effects of those things. Things like air fresheners, for example, that we may not really think much about, have toxins in them that we can be exposed to. So there's also controversy involved in this, the idea of applying common sense. The European Union has banned beef from the United States and from Canada because we use a variety of hormones that make the cattle grow faster, mature quicker, put on more muscle mass quicker, so we can sell them quicker. The European Union uses the precautionary principle with respect to GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We'll cover those in a later chapter as well. But they're cautious about allowing food items that may have been genetically modified into their country for consumption by their people, simply because they haven't been out on the market for all that long, and we simply don't know what some of those chronic effects might be if we're exposed to GMOs or the hormones that are in cattle. There's been some concern or some speculation when we look at the human population in the developed countries like the United States. It seems from the data that our children are reaching sexual maturity quicker than they used to. And there's concern, no proof at this point, but concern that it could be because of the consumption of hormones that are put in our livestock to make them bigger and bulkier and grow quicker. Again, those kinds of things are constantly being researched, but it may be decades or longer before we even know what, if any, types of effects these chemicals do actually have. Another specific case study to end this chapter, there are a lot of industrial and agricultural chemicals that have this endocrine disruptor effect. Some of them may mimic hormones. So the hormones are what drive our development, reproduction, things like that. And so when these chemicals get into the environment, we're seeing some of these effects on things like alligators. They can cause reproductive disorders, basically things like infertility or hormonally related cancers. Cancer is largely just sort of an uncontrolled growth of a cell. And so anything that can cause our cells to grow in a different way could potentially result in a type of cancer. Because of this, Congress amended the Food Quality Protection Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1996 to basically develop a plan for testing for these potential endocrine disruptors. And again, we're seeing this in the environment in Florida, where alligators are having abnormalities in the reproductive systems, making them sterile in one way or another. So again, how likely is this to be able to transmit into the human population? Well, it's possible, but again, at this point, we just don't have the research or the data that can tell us exactly what the risk is to humans. But that's exactly why the EPA has mandated us to do a lot more testing on this. So kind of to end this chapter, it's all about us individuals making informed decisions. We have some friends that have totally gotten away from any foods that have preservatives in them, basically any pre-packaged food. They try and buy all natural foods, no canned things that have preservatives in them, the meat that's fresh and hormone free. I don't know that they're any healthier than we are, but that philosophy is more common today because we just don't know what's in these products. Well, I should say we know what's in the products. We can read the label, but we have no idea what most of those chemicals are, or we have no idea what any of those chemicals might do to our body. So just pick up a typical packaged product and, lunch meat, packaged lunch meat, or even cheese that's already graded in a bag for you, and just start looking at the list of chemicals that are in those products. Again, some of those may be perfectly benign, no positive or negative impacts, but most of those chemicals haven't been tested long enough for us to really know if they have those kind of chronic long-term effects. So again, be a good consumer, read those product labels, ask those manufacturers questions, look up those chemicals, see what you can find out about them, and then make a good decision for yourself.